The rain fell in long, silvery sheets, soaking through her gown until the lace clung heavy against her skin. She stood there alone at the edge of the churchyard, white dress now muddied at the hem, flowers wilting in her trembling hands. The guests had all gone, whispers trailing off into the storm as they hurried away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Her groom had vanished hours ago, and with him, every promise, every dream she had built her heart upon. She could not bring herself to leave, as though standing there in the rain might somehow turn back time, might somehow make him come running down the street with an apology on his lips. But the only sound was the relentless rain in her own breaking breath. Her veil plastered itself against her face, and she tore it off, holding it in her fists like something that had betrayed her. Her body shook with the cold, with the humiliation that burned hotter than fire, but she did not cry. Not yet. Tears seemed too merciful for a wound so raw. She lifted her eyes to the church's stone steps, where drops trickled like tiny rivers. Her life had been rewritten in one brutal moment. A bride without a wedding, a wife without a husband. A soul abandoned before her story even began. She started walking, though she had no destination. The streets were empty except for the storm, and each step of her bare feet on the slick pavement felt like an echo of her desolation. Her shoes had been lost in the mud outside the church. She clutched her bouquet tighter, its petals torn and falling, until one red rose slipped free and was carried away by the rushing water at the edge of the street. That was when she heard it, a small voice, soft but clear through the pounding of rain. "Are you an angel?" She turned, startled, and her gaze fell on a little girl standing under the overhang of a shop. Her dress was patched and too big for her, her auburn hair tangled and wet, freckles dotting her pale face like scattered stars. She held no umbrella, no coat, only wide, searching eyes. "What?" the bride whispered, her throat raw, unsure if the child was real or just a ghost summoned by her pain. The girl stepped closer, the rain catching on her lashes. "You came from heaven, didn't you? You look like you fell from the sky." The bride let out a broken laugh, sharp and bitter. "From heaven? No, little one, not from heaven." But the child tilted her head, studying the ruined gown, the flowers falling apart in her hand, the crown of wilted blooms still tangled in her hair. "You look like a princess. Only angels and princesses wear dresses like that." The words pierced through her grief, and for the first time that day, something inside her softened. She crouched down, the wet fabric pooling around her knees. "What are you doing out here alone?" she asked gently. The girl's eyes flickered. "Mom is working. She said to wait, but she's late." Her voice carried the tone of someone used to waiting, used to being left in corners. The bride looked at her, at the trembling thin arms wrapped around herself, and felt a pang deeper than her own heartbreak. She thought of the man who had walked away, of the empty life that awaited her now, and for a brief moment, she envied the child's simple hope, the kind that still believed strangers in ruined wedding dresses might be angels. "Come here," she said softly. She extended her hand, and after a moment of hesitation, the little girl slipped her small fingers into hers. Warmth shot through the bride's frozen body, and her throat tightened with unshed tears. They stood like that, two souls abandoned in different ways, bound by the storm. "What's your name?" the bride asked. "Clara," the girl replied, freckles dancing as she tried to smile. "What's yours?" The bride swallowed hard. Her name felt heavy, tied to the shame of what had just happened. But as she looked into the child's innocent eyes, she felt a strange freedom. "Grace," she whispered at last. Clara nodded as if it were the most fitting name in the world. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "You really did come from heaven, didn't you, Grace?" And for the first time that day, Grace let her tears fall, not out of weakness, but because in that moment, through the eyes of a freckled little girl, she began to believe she might not be entirely lost after all. The rain did not let up. It came down as though the heavens had broken open and emptied themselves over the quiet little town, drumming against rooftops, spilling off gutters, gathering in streams that twisted along the streets. Grace sat with Clara beneath the awning of the closed shop, the weight of her gown pulling her down like an anchor. She no longer tried to fight the tears. They mingled with the rain, slipping over her cheeks until she could no longer tell where sorrow ended and the storm began. Clara, in her small way, tried to comfort her, slipping closer, leaning her head against Grace's shoulder as though she had always known her. The touch startled Grace at first. She was used to being careful, composed, always smiling, always making sure no one saw the cracks beneath. But here was a child she had never met, laying her trust so openly on her shoulder, as if to say, "You are safe enough for me to rest on." Grace's chest heaved with a quiet sob, and her arm instinctively wrapped around Clara, pulling her close against the sodden lace of her gown. "You're cold," Grace murmured, rubbing the little girl's arm. Clara shrugged. "I'm used to it." Those words hit her harder than any insult whispered behind her back as she stood alone at the church. She studied Clara's bare feet, the bruises on her knees, the way her dress barely clung to her small frame. The child wasn't just waiting, she was surviving. And Grace, for all her broken heart, could not bear to let her sit there one moment longer. "Where does your mama work?" Grace asked softly. Clara pointed down the street, toward the glow of a diner's neon sign, its light shimmering through the downpour. "There." Grace hesitated. She didn't want to walk back into the world just yet, not where people might recognize her, might whisper again about the bride left behind. But when she looked at Clara, shivering and clinging to her bouquet as though it were treasure, she knew she couldn't let her fear outweigh the need to protect this little girl. "Come on," she said, standing and gathering her ruined skirt in one hand. She reached for Clara's hand with the other, and together they stepped out into the rain. The storm pelted them mercilessly, soaking them through, but somehow, walking with Clara at her side made Grace feel less heavy. The diner was only a few blocks away, though each step felt longer in her bare feet, sharp gravel and cold water biting against her skin. Clara glanced up at her more than once, as though checking to see if she would disappear, and each time, Grace squeezed her hand tighter, wordlessly assuring her she wouldn't. By the time they pushed open the diner door, the smell of frying food and coffee enveloped them. Heads turned immediately. The room fell into an uneasy hush as the townsfolk took in the sight. The bride, once radiant and full of promise, now drenched and bedraggled, standing beside a little girl whose freckles glowed against her pale, wet face. Grace wanted to shrink into the floor, but Clara tugged her forward, guiding her toward the counter where a tired-looking woman in an apron stood wiping her hands. Her eyes widened when she saw Clara, then shifted to Grace with confusion. "Clara, what on earth?" And, "Oh my lord," the woman's voice faltered as she took in Grace's dress, the bouquet clutched in her hand, the veil dangling from her wrist like a ghost. "Mama," Clara said quickly, as if afraid Grace might vanish, "this is Grace. She's an angel. She found me." The mother blinked, her face caught between disbelief and pity. She looked at Grace, whose chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths, whose lips trembled though she fought to keep her chin lifted. For a moment, no words came, and then the woman moved around the counter, dropping to her knees to embrace her daughter. "You scared me half to death," she whispered fiercely, holding Clara tight. "I told you to wait inside." But she was there, Clara insisted. "She was all alone, Mama. She needed me." The woman's eyes softened, though they shone with unshed tears. She looked back at Grace. "You poor thing," she murmured. I heard what happened." Grace stiffened. The words were like knives, dragging her humiliation back into the open. But before she could speak, the woman reached out, laying a hand gently on her arm. "You shouldn't be alone tonight. Please, sit. Warm yourself. Let me bring you something hot to drink." Grace wanted to refuse, to flee back into the rain and vanish where no one could see her shame. But Clara tugged at her hand again, urging her toward one of the booths. "Sit with me," she pleaded, freckles glowing under the diner's light. Something in Grace broke then, not in pain, but in surrender. She allowed herself to slide into the booth, the soaked fabric of her dress heavy against the vinyl seat. Clara climbed in beside her, leaning against her side as though they had always belonged together. Moments later, a mug of steaming cocoa was set before her, the scent rising like comfort from another life. Grace wrapped her trembling fingers around it, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Clara reached for her own cup, sipping eagerly, chocolate staining her upper lip. Grace found herself watching her, and despite the storm inside her heart, the corners of her mouth twitched upward. "You have a beautiful daughter," she said softly to the woman. The mother nodded, her gaze fixed on Clara with love laced in weariness. "She's all I have. She's the reason I keep going." Her eyes lingered on Grace for a moment longer, filled with something unspoken, then she returned to her work. Grace sat there in silence, staring at the steam rising from her cup, at the way Clara's small hand rested against hers on the table. The ache inside her was still there, sharp and relentless, but beneath it, something new stirred. A fragile thread of belonging, of being seen not for what she had lost, but for what she might still be. Grace, Clara whispered suddenly, her voice soft as if sharing a secret, maybe you didn't come from heaven. Maybe you came here, for me. The words lodged deep in Grace's heart, breaking it all over again, but this time, in a way that felt like healing. The diner buzzed around them, the storm raged outside, but in that booth, beneath the soft glow of the neon sign, Grace realized that the story she thought had ended at the church steps was only just beginning. The storm outside pressed against the diner's windows, a relentless drumming that seemed to echo the pulse in Grace's ears. The world she had known only hours ago was gone, shattered in the moment her groom chose to disappear, yet here she sat with a child pressed to her side as though she had been waiting for her all along. Clara sipped her cocoa noisily, smiling up at Grace with the unguarded joy of someone who saw no brokenness, only light. Grace clutched her own cup, staring into its dark surface as though it might reveal the answers she was too afraid to ask. She could still hear the whispers from earlier, the pitying looks, the way the townsfolk had hurried past her collapsed figure at the church steps. She had been left in the rain like an afterthought, discarded, humiliated. And yet, when Clara's hand had reached for hers, none of that had mattered. Something inside her had cracked open, wide enough for warmth to creep in. She had not come here searching for salvation. She had stumbled into it. Mama says angels watch over people, Clara said suddenly, her voice sticky sweet with chocolate. I think you're mine. Grace's throat closed. She wanted to protest, to tell her she was no angel, just a woman who had been foolish enough to believe in promises that were never meant to last. But Clara's faith, pure and unshaken, wrapped around her like a blanket. She couldn't take that away. Instead, she brushed a strand of wet hair from Clara's face and whispered, maybe we found each other because we both needed someone tonight. The little girl's freckles scrunched as she smiled, and Grace felt her heart lurch in a way that was almost painful. The diner slowly filled with murmurs again, people returning to their meals, though their eyes occasionally drifted toward the soaked bride sitting in the booth. Grace felt each glance like a needle. She wanted to vanish into the walls, but Clara's small body pressed close kept her grounded. She forced herself to sip her cocoa, to pretend she belonged here, though every fiber of her being screamed that she didn't. Time passed in uncertain fragments. The storm softened, the neon lights buzzed, plates clattered behind the counter. Clara eventually leaned against Grace, her eyelids drooping as the warmth and sweetness lured her toward sleep. Grace slid an arm around her, holding her as gently as if she were porcelain. It felt strangely natural, the way Clara's breathing steadied against her side, as though she had been holding her all her life. When the child's mother returned to collect the empty cups, her gaze lingered on Grace again. You can't stay here all night, she said softly. Do you have somewhere to go? Grace hesitated. She thought of her parents, but the shame of facing them tonight, drenched and abandoned, was unbearable. She thought of her small apartment, cold and empty, the bed that would feel like a grave now. She shook her head, unable to speak. The woman's expression softened with understanding. We don't have much, but you can come with us, at least until morning. I can't leave you out there like this. Grace wanted to refuse, to insist she was fine, but Clara stirred, mumbling in her sleep and clutching Grace's hand tighter. The words died on her lips. She could not walk away from her. Not yet. So she nodded, whispering a hoarse, thank you. Later, when the diner closed, Grace followed them into the night. The storm had quieted into a mist, the streets slick and gleaming under the street lamps. Clara skipped ahead despite her exhaustion, pointing out puddles and laughing when her reflection rippled. Grace carried her bouquet still, though it was nothing but stems and broken petals now. She didn't know why she held on to it, perhaps because letting it go would mean acknowledging the finality of everything she had lost. They reached a small apartment above a laundromat, the stairwell creaking beneath their feet. Inside, it was modest, worn, but filled with warmth that made Grace's chest ache. Toys were scattered in one corner, a quilt draped across the couch, the faint smell of lavender clinging to the air. Clara flopped onto a faded armchair, hugging a stuffed bear to her chest, while her mother fetched blankets. You can sleep here, she said, spreading them across the couch. It's not much, but it's warm. Grace touched the fabric, her throat thick. It's more than enough. Clara crawled up beside her before she could settle in, curling against her like a kitten. Grace looked down at her, then at her mother, uncertain. But the woman only gave a small, weary smile. She trusts you. That doesn't happen often. Let her. So Grace lay there, dress still damp, hair tangled, mascara long washed away, holding the child who had declared her an angel. For the first time in hours, perhaps in years, she let sleep claim her. Morning came slowly, the gray light of dawn spilling through the thin curtains. Grace stirred to the sound of Clara humming softly, her little fingers tracing the lace of Grace's dress. When their eyes met, Clara grinned. See, you didn't disappear. Grace laughed weakly. Neither did you. The hours that followed unfolded like fragile glass, moments Grace knew she would hold onto long after this night was just memory. Clara showed her the picture books stacked by her bed, introduced her to the bear named Thomas, and insisted on braiding a lock of Grace's damp hair. The mother brewed coffee, her gaze never far from Grace, her silence heavy with questions she never asked aloud. Grace lingered far longer than she should have, caught between the world she had lost and the strange, delicate bond she had found. Every time she thought to leave, Clara's hand tugged at her, or her voice asked another question, or her freckles lit up with a smile that was impossible to walk away from. Hours became days. Days stretched into a week. She told herself it was only temporary, that she was waiting for the humiliation to fade, for her strength to return. But each night she found herself back on that couch, each morning greeted by Clara's freckled face and soft voice, she realized she wasn't waiting at all. She was healing. The townsfolk whispered, of course. They always did. The bride who had been left at the altar, now spending her days with a child not her own, her nights in a stranger's home. Grace heard the rumors when she ventured out, felt the stares when she walked the streets. But for once, their words didn't hollow her out. She had Clara's laughter to drown them out, Clara's hand in hers to remind her she wasn't alone. She found work at the diner after a while, wiping tables, pouring coffee, her dress traded for an apron. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it kept her close to the only people who made her feel seen. Clara sat in the corner with her crayons while her mother cooked, humming as though the world were nothing but colors waiting to be drawn. Grace found herself humming too sometimes, the ache inside her no longer constant, replaced by something she didn't dare name. Nights were still hard. There were moments when the silence pressed too heavy, when she remembered the vows she would never speak, the life she would never have. But then Clara would curl against her, murmuring in her sleep, and the loneliness eased. Grace realized that the future she had imagined was gone, but perhaps another had been placed in her hands, fragile and unexpected, but no less real. One evening, weeks later, Clara tugged at her hand as they walked home beneath the fading light. "Grace?" she asked, freckles glowing like embers. "Yes, sweetheart." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "You'll stay forever, won't you?" The words lodged in Grace's chest, too heavy and too light all at once. She wanted to say yes, to promise with every fiber of her being. But promises were dangerous things, she had learned that the hardest way. Still, when she looked down at Clara's hopeful eyes, she knew she couldn't deny her. "I'll stay," she whispered. "As long as you need me." Clara squeezed her hand tight, and in that moment, Grace realized it was not just the child who needed her. She needed Clara too. The rain came again that night, tapping against the windows, a softer echo of the storm that had once left her abandoned. Grace lay awake on the couch, listening to its rhythm, and for the first time she did not feel afraid of what the rain might take away. Instead, she felt its promise, that even in the fiercest storm, there could be new beginnings waiting, if only one dared to reach for them. The months passed like rivers, carrying Grace farther away from the night she had stood alone in the rain, her gown heavy with sorrow, her heart torn open by betrayal. The whispers still lingered in town, but they had dulled into background noise. She no longer shrank beneath them, she walked through them with Clara's hand in hers and a quiet strength that came from being broken and rebuilt in ways no one could see. The no longer shrank beneath them. She walked through them with Clara's hand in hers and a quiet strength that came from being broken and rebuilt in ways no one could see. The diner became her second skin. She knew its hum by heart, the clang of dishes, the hiss of coffee, the creak of the booth where Clara always sat scribbling with crayons. The regulars who once gossiped about her began to soften, watching as she worked tirelessly, never complaining, always smiling for the little girl who shadowed her every move. Grace carried trays and wiped counters with the air of someone who had chosen, rather than settled. Each night, she returned upstairs to the small apartment where warmth greeted her in ways no grand house or lavish ceremony ever could. Clara grew more attached by the day. She would race into Grace's arms after school, Freckles dancing with delight as though no time apart had passed at all. She asked endless questions about angels and heaven, about weddings and love, about why some people leave and why others stay. Grace never lied, but she learned to shape her answers with care, giving Clara enough truth to trust but not enough to wound. They became two halves of the same song, one's laughter filling the silence of the other, one's comfort mending the bruises the world had left behind. But even as Grace found herself sinking deeper into this unexpected life, shadows of her past trailed her. There were nights when she woke gasping, the image of the church steps flashing in her mind, the echo of vows never spoken ringing in her ears. She would slip quietly to the kitchen, trembling hands gripping the counter, until she felt Clara's small arms wrap around her waist. Clara always seemed to know when the ghosts came. She would say nothing, only rest her head against Grace's side until the trembling stilled. It was in those moments Grace realized the child was not just healing because of her, she was healing because of Clara too. One afternoon, near the end of summer, Clara's mother fell ill. The diner could not close, bills could not stop, and so Grace stepped fully into a role she had not expected. She managed the counter, cooked simple meals, cleaned, comforted customers, and then returned home to care for Clara and her mother. The days blurred, exhaustion clawing at her bones, but never once did she falter. She had been left at the altar, yes, but she refused to abandon the family who had embraced her in her darkest hour. Clara watched her with wide, unwavering eyes. "You're like Mama," she said one night, tugging at Grace's hand as they folded laundry. "You take care of me even when you're tired. That's what mamas do." The words pierced Grace's heart. She did not answer right away, her hands trembling over a small shirt as she tried to steady herself. Finally, she whispered, "I'm not your mama, Clara." "Yes, you are," Clara said simply, as though truth needed no permission. "You came when I needed you. You stayed. Mamas stay." Grace could not breathe for a moment. She bent down, cupping Clara's freckled face, pressing her forehead gently against hers. "Then I will stay, always. I promise." Promises had once been her undoing, but with Clara, the words felt different. They were not fragile, not spoken with the false charm of a man who would vanish. They were anchored in something stronger, something Grace could trust. The town noticed. Whispers shifted from pity to quiet respect, from gossip to admiration. People began to see not the jilted bride, but the woman who carried others through storms, who found family where none had existed. And though Grace had never asked for redemption, it came to her slowly, like sunlight filtering through heavy clouds. As the years unfolded, Clara blossomed. She grew taller, her freckles multiplying like constellations, her hair wild and untamed. Grace braided it each morning before school, kissed her cheek, and waved until she disappeared inside the building. Teachers spoke of Clara's brightness, her kindness, the way she spoke of angels as if she had seen them. Grace always smiled, though her chest swelled with emotions she could hardly name. On Clara's 10th birthday, Grace baked a cake from scratch, the kitchen filled with laughter and flour dust. They lit candles, and Clara clasped her hands, whispering a wish before blowing them out. Later that night, as they lay curled together beneath the quilt, Clara whispered, "Do you know what I wished for?" "What, my love?" "That you'll never leave. That even when I'm big, you'll still be here." Tears stung Grace's eyes in the dark. She kissed the crown of Clara's head, whispering, "I'll always be here." She meant it with every fiber of her being. But life has a way of testing even the truest of vows. One autumn evening, Grace saw him, the man who had left her at the altar. He stood in the doorway of the diner, older, eyes shadowed with regret. He asked to speak to her, his voice trembling with apologies she had once ached to hear. But as she looked at him, she felt nothing of what she had once felt. No anger, no yearning, no desire for closure. She only saw a stranger who had opened a wound that had since been healed by the small hand of a freckled child. "I don't need your words," she said simply. "I found my life without them." And she turned back to Clara, who sat at the counter coloring, her smile brighter than anything the man could offer. That night, as the rain pattered softly outside, Grace realized she had truly let go. The past no longer chained her. The storm had not destroyed her, it had carried her to where she was meant to be. Years later, when Clara stood in her own white dress, radiant and trembling, Grace watched from the first few, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. This time, the groom did not flee. He waited at the altar, eyes full of love that could not be shaken. Clara turned, freckles glowing beneath her veil, and searched the crowd until her gaze found Grace. Their eyes met, and Clara smiled the smile of a child who once believed in angels. "You came from heaven, didn't you?" she had once asked. And now, standing on the edge of her own future, Clara's smile seemed to say she still believed it. Grace's heart swelled, no longer with grief but with a fullness she could hardly contain. She had been left in the rain, abandoned and broken. But that night, a little girl with freckles had reached for her hand and pulled her into a story she never could have written for herself. A story of love not bound by vows, but by staying, by choosing, by becoming what someone else needed most. The world had tried to define her by loss, but in Clara's eyes, she had always been more. She had been an angel, a mother, a home. And as Clara walked toward her future, Grace knew that every tear, every storm, every step through the rain had led her here, too. This moment, to this love, to this life that was hers after all.